7% of the world's economy is circular.
Today we're talking about the circular economy. So this isn't a conversation about celebrating circularity as an idea. It's about examining where it breaks and what it costs.
Businesses ultimately had it easy, but not a huge surprise that businesses became lazy.
Economics drives business. Business models effectively are all about selling more. We're very good at selling more. We're not very good at recovering more.
That there for me is to come back to that kind of the inconvenient truth, which is the sort of the message in the podcast, is that the inconvenient truth is that until we reframe that, until we stop using growth as a metric for success and economic success, things won't necessarily change as quickly as we need to. It's not a knowledge gap, it's an incentive gap, it's a decision gap. Welcome to Inconvenient Truths, a podcast from Granger Reis. This series looks at what actually happens when leadership ambitions meet operational reality inside complex industries. Today, we're talking about the circular economy. It's widely agreed in principle. Most organisations support the direction of travel, but in practice, it remains a small part of the real economy. And for many businesses, it's slower, harder, and more complex than the narrative suggests. So this isn't a conversation about celebrating circularity as an idea. It's about examining where it breaks and what it costs. Joining me are leaders working at the centre of these systems across investments, operations, infrastructure, and sustainability. So let's start with a simple question. What is circular economy actually asking businesses to do differently? And if I can come to you, David, on that one.
Well, maybe I'll start with a bit of context. I always like a bit of context with circularity. And, there's a well-known statistic, 7% of the world's economy is circular. I tend to try and reposition that 93% is linear. I think that when you're talking about 100 billion tonnes of material which is extracted every year, 93 billion tonnes is used once. So that gives you the sort of magnitude, I think, as I say, always interesting to get a bit of context. It's also 50 years almost to the day that Walter Stahl, who is the creator of the circular economy thinking in Geneva, introduced his paper about introducing the circular economy. So we're sort of at a very pivotal moment. There's lots of things happening in the world, which really says that we do need to move to greater circularity.
And what do you think in that sort of initial thinking, in his ideas, but also in terms of the way it's evolved, they were asking businesses to do differently? Fundamentally, what is it that we're trying to get businesses to do differently? And then, John, if you want to pick that up.
Yeah, so I think what you're trying to really get a business to think about is how do you actually embed it into your organisational way of thinking? I think all too often when it comes to recycling, depends which word you use around circular, there's recycling, there's recovery, but businesses tend to think about the here and now, and they think about what's in front of them and what they need to do, as opposed to maybe sitting there and thinking about how do you bake that into the supply chain. And I think the organisations that do it well do it in all parts of their organisation. So whether it's through to KPIs, whether it's through to incentive schemes, or just through to their supply chain and procurement. So I think that's really the art of making a difference, is if you can bed it into your organisation.
That makes good sense. Dan?
Yeah, I think it's about, in a quite sort of practical way, asking businesses to do things differently. So where they have been, in a linear role, thinking about how can they increase the recycled content, perhaps, of their packaging, and how can they think about it from end to end. So from the start, through the process, through the supply chain, and all the collaborations that they need to do throughout the supply chain. So it is about asking businesses to think differently and to do something different. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to cost more, but it does mean that they need system changes and they need that sort of regulatory context to be able to achieve that.
Tim, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think if you think about that 50 years, let's call that the era of abundance. When supply chains grew, global markets became accessible pretty much to everybody. I think businesses ultimately had it easy because technology evolved, supply chains evolved, the planet became smaller because of containerization and the kind of swathing investments in infrastructure. And so delivering on that abundance, making money, being successful, being seen as successful, actually became easier and easier as the years went by. And so it's not a huge surprise that businesses became, I mean, you can call it lazy, but it's probably taking the fastest route to satisfy the demand that they had in their business, in their market. I think what we've got now, of course, is we're moving from an era of easy abundance to one where it needs a lot more thought. As the guys have just described, businesses need to think much more carefully about how they're going to satisfy that demand for abundance. Whether that's legislation, whether that's just culture, corporate culture, supply chain culture. I think those two things need to come together.
And in terms of the commercial sense behind circularity, obviously there's a sustainability element to it. And I think today I really wanted to push around the fact that whilst it is a nice to have, what we really wanted to focus in on is why does it make commercial sense? So David, from your perspective, it seems to make commercial sense, but therefore why hasn't it been taken up more widely, do you think?
Well, there's a lot of reasons why it can't be taken up, or there's a huge resistance. As I say, go back to my 93 billion, there's a reason 200 years baked in of linear behaviour. I think economics drives business. I think we can talk about sustainability. It's, as we believe, probably as a collective, that's the right thing to do. It's so deeply driven into business models. Business models effectively are all about selling more. We're very good at selling more. We're not very good at recovering more. So the economics of virgin materials are very strong. Just look at plastics as a really good example of that. The difference between PET, which is from oil, and rPET, recycled PET, which moves and is highly volatile. So it's very difficult to run a business without stable underlying business elements to your business. I think that would be one good thing. I don't think products are particularly designed for circularity. I think there is one major issue. I talked a little bit about collaboration through the whole of the chain. That's essential. Really, if you don't design from the beginning, there's very little that companies like Circular Economy can do at the end. You're really trying to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear at that particular time. And we do our best. I think we do a very good job of managing that. But we really do need to change that. And then it's what's going to drive big companies to change. Well, then probably it is around, some security issues around, the supply chains that they have themselves. If resources are finite, which they are, we're living in a 3-planet usage of our materials. You'll get to a point where things become difficult. Today we see few geopolitical shocks, which you could sort of show as being a brist in the way that we can get hold of materials. And look how quickly supply chains fall over, and give us a sort of a view of the future, maybe, of where companies will have to then rethink, reshore a lot of their production.
Well, and I'll definitely come back to that, because I think those interruptions are really important. I think just to sort of start from that sort of starting position is, where do you in your businesses sort of see circular initiatives slowing performance? So I just want to try and really get to that kind of sense of why isn't it working? And then from there, we can start to build towards that sense of, okay, how do we make it work? How do we start to sort of learn from our mistakes, if you like? So just interested in, perhaps from you, sort of, Tim, to start with, then I'll come to you, Diane. Where do you see those circular initiatives slowing performance rather than enhancing them?
Yeah, I mean, that is a really good question, because I feel that at the heart of that question is, what is the measure of good performance? So, I've spent most of the last 15 years in around retail, fashion, consumer electronics, and ultimately performance over that period was predominantly measured in relatively narrow manner. Its volume of sales, its margin. And therefore, if those are the measures of good performance, organizational culture is then built to relentlessly drive at those outcomes. And actually, what I've seen a few times is initiatives appear within the customer base or within a particular industry. I'm sure you guys have seen similar, where a customer, a client, an organization, you can see them starting to make positive moves towards better understanding their ability to recover assets, inventory, resell, reuse that inventory. Think differently about how they design products to sort of improve the sort of reuse, even if not the whole product, but some of the componentry. But these are industries that have relatively short cycles. They're measured every 6 months, probably very publicly. And therefore, good performance is delivering short-term results in the year, that therefore drive better share price or drive better reputation. A lot of these initiatives don't deliver the results immediately at scale that then start to affect those things that the business is being measured by. And then you start to see them waver because, the attention to them, the ambition to support them maybe falls away. Ultimately, it's got to come down to how does a business measure itself? What is good performance? What are we gonna die in a ditch over? What are we gonna stand for? And then building that capability behind it. And accepting it might not be perfect on day one, but that in order to satisfy your customers and your market in the future, this is the right thing to do. And I think it comes down to a little bit back to intuitive leadership and intuitive management.
Absolutely.
Which maybe has gone a bit in recent times. I think the industries I've worked in, for the previous sort of 20 years, I think intuitive management has been quite hard to find. It's formulaic management. And in times of change, you need more intuitive leaders, I think.
That makes good sense. And Diane, Reconomy's platform is about delivering circular solutions to a whole variety of different industries. And I guess interested to see when you're positioning those services, how you have to think about cost, complexity, where that becomes a barrier to using your particular services, but also sort of referring back to what Tim was saying there about, perhaps where initiatives are perceived to slow things down. So just interested to see how you guys at Reconomy respond to that.
Yeah, I think probably taking an example from the UK supermarkets. So at scale, there's actually some really good recycling going on. So in the background, in terms of cardboard, and that's done really well at scale. Plastics, soft plastics now, metals. And I think people forget that. They kind of, it's just one of those that kind of sort of happens, but it is there and it is working really well as a system. I think the other one is probably we'd all go into supermarkets, and when you first go in, you'll see the fruit and veg. And the trays there, you might notice, they're all plastic trays, and that is a perfectly closed solution there. So those trays are from recycled plastic. They're reused. They go back to the supplier. They put their bananas, cucumbers, whatever in, and they're washed, and then they come back into the supermarket back hauled. So that works really well as a solution. Where that doesn't work so well for supermarkets would be things like pasta, cereals, that sort of thing, where you'll notice they come in on cardboard packaging. So that system is a lot more linear. Okay, the cardboard goes back for recycling, but the actual system is more linear. So so I just think that's something that we would all see every day in the supermarket. And looking at that, and you can see there are some things that go on that are done at scale and do work for the consumer and for the business.
Thank you. And Jon, taking that into a more industrial lens within the construction sector, how do you see that playing out, and where do you see the sort of difficult being put into the two difficult category versus it making commercial and, I suppose, economic sense?
So I think probably the biggest challenge in construction, I would say, is the fact that we don't have the same metric for all of the activities. Yep. So when we talk about circular, 1 minute we're talking about carbon, and the next minute we might be talking about reuse. The metric's not the same. So you're not aligned with everybody in the chain of the build. So if you look at, say, something like if you're building in one of the big cities in the country, then everything about what goes into that is about the carbon, not about the circularity of the product that was made. And actually people then assume that because it's recycled or it's reused, that it's less carbon. That's actually not factually always correct, because depending how far you travel, it makes a difference. So on one hand, you're trying to make yourself more circular, you're trying to recover and reuse more. But on the other hand is that potentially what you're doing is having a separate metric for your client working against you. So I think one of the challenges we have is how we align those metrics to make sure that it creates an overall circular economy as opposed to just various parts of it for various stages of the build.
I think there may be also a difference between localized supply chains and international supply chains. The UK has managed to outsource its production of most things for many years now and places its carbon, its greenhouse emissions, its use of water in the hands of others who perhaps can ill afford to give that. I'll give you a good example of that. I was horrified to understand the impact that just producing jeans costs in the world. It takes almost 10,000 litres of water to produce a pair of jeans.
Wow.
And there's 6 billion pairs a year, producing about 45 trillion litres of water that are used for that. 30% of those jeans are never even bought or worn. So you can see, going back to your point, Tim, about, the business model's all about driving short-term growth. We've managed to externalise, our sustainability or others who've got different interests to us. Where Jon locally in his building projects can do awful lot of good by controlling the materials and flowing them around the UK. As soon as you leave the UK borders, we're dealing with a very different problem. These externalities are not costed into the true cost of the damage the delivery of those jeans or other materials do.
And I'll sort of come to each of you in turn on this one, but do you think that those perceived benefits of circularity are ignored in the face of, or maybe at the behest in the sort of the excuses given around maybe geopolitical shocks as an example? So we want it now, it's too difficult. How do we start to reframe that? How do we start to say, okay, so that's a reality. We do need X sort of numbers of gigatons of certain materials to sort of fuel the technology boom, to fuel data centers. Where are the solutions? And how do we start to reframe them in such a way that those companies can gain economic benefit from leaning into it?
I think one of the challenges we have is just society has evolved in a way, like in business, the society behind business, and consumers and consumerism. But society's evolved to a place where it's very difficult, if not impossible, to look beyond relatively short time horizons.
So it comes back to that again, the short-termism.
Yeah, really short-termism. So if you think about the public kind of hammering that major projects have here in the UK, big infrastructure investments, which are never easy to deliver, and the myth that they do this much better in other parts of the world and, they're cheaper, happen quicker. I mean, it is absolutely that. It is a myth. We have a small congested island with, lots of Victorian infrastructure that still sits at the heart of how we move, live, hospitals, how we work day to day. Very complicated environment. But in order to gain approval or support, we actually end up selling those projects on relatively short-term measures, like immediate benefit to the users rather than the long-term improvement in society and benefits. And so, again, what that drives is, where you ask the question, where are those products? Where are those solutions which drive up circularity in a robust and sustainable fashion that can be repeated time and time again? They're hard to do when you're being pressed on a very tight program where governments are making commitments that those promises you can't keep, kind of thing, because they're not kind of in the middle of the detail and the information. So I think it's very difficult. So how do you tackle that? Well, I think it absolutely comes top down. So the big buyers of materials, the leaders in retail and consumerism, those kind of operators of infrastructure need to change the language and need to change the message. Maybe historically, you and I have worked in railways over a number of years in and around that industry. The safety culture in that industry has transformed over the last 15, 20 years, literally transformed. Yes, triggered by some major safety events, but led by inspirational leaders who realised things needed to change and the time was now, and actually drove that culture change through an entire industry. I wonder whether, we're actually close to a point where the cost of abundance is a disaster, not unlike a major rail accident. And what it needs is the leaders in an industry to then say, actually, we're not going to let this happen again. We're not going to let ourselves get into a position where it takes trillions of litres of water to make jeans, and actually 30% of those products are never ever going to be sold and worn, and no value is going to come out of them. It's the big leadership challenge, isn't it?
David, I see you smiling there.
Yeah, well, it's this short-term political mandate of 5 years, and even now we face maybe even a shorter mandate. So how do you put in that systemic change in such a short period? And this is where politicians and others, business, have really got to come together and look at a view of 25 years. Infrastructure isn't, as Tim's saying, it's not built in 5 years. It's built over a long, long period of time. And you really need an agreement, cross-party, cross-business, to what sort of world or what sort of UK do we want? And then how are we going to deliver that? And then there's lots of things you can do within your country, because a lot of things go to waste. So as I say, we're very bad at capturing materials. We spend a lot of the time exporting valuable materials to dubious locations. Sort of electrical and electronic waste is a great example of that. We send a lot of it, 40% to Africa. And, the sort of practices there are, manual, poor, maybe near slave labour.
And you lose sight of the provenance of the
products. Yeah. In that is lithium and cobalt and various other very, very valuable materials which are needed by the very industries in the UK, British Aerospace, etc. But we're very happy to send them abroad because it's easier, out of sight, out of mind, missing the point that it's all about a resilience to our economy and controlling those materials. Ultimately, the stewardships of those which will become super vital in the future. And if you don't see that, those companies who don't recognise that, at some point will have a problem.
And Diane, coming to you, obviously it's a business that recognises the value in reusing, the value in recycling and reducing. How do we start to disrupt those behaviours, do you think? How do we start to get a focus on seeing those waste items as a resource, not as a problem to dispose of overseas?
Yeah, I think some of those sort of geopolitical incidents and so on that we've had over the last few years has really highlighted. I think there's only sort of 3 main countries that these rare minerals come from. So, you're absolutely right. If we can get our recycling right for electronics, I don't know about everyone around this table, but I know that I've got a few old mobile phones and so on back, and so we just need to improve the way we do that, get all those machines back into circulation and reuse. And there are quite a few companies doing that now, or recycling and trying to onshore that as much as possible. There seems to be a bit more of a shift now to that sort of nationalism, I suppose, for wanting to bring that recycling onshore. So for example, Reconomy has recently invested in the UK for plastics recycling, sorting, and then into pellets and then back into plastic products in this country. So, and that's really helping to support that market, because if you haven't got those market drivers for the recyclers, it just won't happen. So you need those companies throughout the supply chain to be able to recycle it, do that properly, do that at high level, and then use those materials back into other products. But you have to have the market to do that, and you have to have market security to do that as well.
And at the heart of that, you sort of mentioned investment, and I feel like innovation and investment is at the core of this. So I'd be interested from your perspective, Jon, when you're thinking about the growth in your company, when you think about investing in different areas of GRS, which obviously is linked to the construction sector, what are the things that are on your mind? And where are you starting to see that disruption? Where are you starting to see people leaning into that disruption?
So I think, firstly, you think about return. You have no choice,
yep.
Which is quite hard. Everything we do is big and expensive when you're recovering. as most people would understand. How we tend to look at things is more around how is it going to get used and over what period of time. So if a regulation is going to fall behind, which generally it does, in terms of how materials get reused, we tend to think about what are we in control of that we can make a difference to. So what will bring forward our view around how we recover, recycle and reuse will be what do we have control of, and that's where you invest first. You'd be brave in our industry if you, and we've seen it sometimes, and we've seen failure where people have got great ideas, but it's just a step too far for the regulation because you need to get a lot of things changed to be able to get the product reused back. Most of what happens in C&D, certainly from the UK's point of view, is down recycled. It's put in for less. It's not. So I think if you can sort, if you can see a way forward where an industry is moving at a faster pace to use a product, maybe because of scarcity for its natural resource, then you would invest heavily. But generally, we invest along the lines of, where can we influence the change? Where can we control the dial more than waiting for the industry to take the end use, which I think is what you referred to, Diane, around, getting those firms to do it, because it's chicken and egg, isn't it? If the firm that wants it's not there, then they don't use it. And if you bring it too early, then you end up with a product that you can't do anything with, that actually gets pushed down the cycle chain and doesn't necessarily make financial sense, or even worse, goes back into a waste again.
It's not just for the companies to deliver resilience for the UK. The politicians, the government have to see it as an integral part of an industrial strategy, a sustainable strategy for this country. I would be a great advocate of a Ministry of Resilience. We've got problems with food production, we have water issues, we've got energy issues. That there's no holistic thinking. Government is split up into an archaic system. DEFRA and, BIS and all these other different types of, they don't speak to each other. There's no coordination. There's no overview of that. And as I go back to my point about the longevity is 25 years, you need a really holistic view. And there's lots of materials that go to waste in the UK. Mobile phones is a great example. There's more gold in a ton of mobile phones than there is a ton of gold ore. Wow. To give you an example of that, yet we're happy to export that to Africa, to dubious different places.
I think just running on from that point, okay, so it's how you bring stuff to the forefront and how it gets screamed about from a political thing. So if you think about VAT in the UK, whilst it may have many benefits to the economy, actually in terms of reuse, it's extremely poor. So we currently bring down about 50,000 buildings a year, okay, in the UK, which probably still had a life between 50 and 100 years. But when you're looking to do that, your new build is zero rated VAT. And if you retrofit that and you reuse it, it's at full VAT. So something as simple as getting the regulation and getting the system right to understand the circular economy would make a huge difference. Because what's driving people is not just the need for it, but it's also the economics of it. So if you think
the incentives are there, aren't they?
No, the incentive isn't there. In fact, in certain places, the incentive works against you.
Counterintuitive.
It's counterintuitive to achieving circularity. So I think that's an important thing, just running on from around the government's thing. It's about, as an industry, I think we could shout slightly more. And that's partly, I think we need to get the message much clearer, much more simply across, to maybe bridge that political divide so it does travel through parliamentary periods.
I think that's an interesting one, isn't it? Which is that the shouting louder comes from finding your voice. And maybe within a lot of these industries that we work, the supply chain is very fragmented. And where you see huge changes being made are in industries that almost charge ahead without really thinking about any geopolitical interest. So technology is a good example where the technology plows on, AI, data centers, mobile phones, and governments then catch up. Whereas it feels in a lot of the industries that we work in, we almost wait for permission before we charge ahead.
I think that's a good observation. But if you think about, I would class retail in this as well. The pace of growth in retail and sort of broader technology. Those industries are fundamentally unregulated. And so a lot of the industries that we serve are regulated. Legislation sits at the heart of pretty much everything we do, and therefore a bit of it is waiting for permission, but a lot of it is also knowing the consequences of falling foul of a regulatory system that is ultimately designed to rinse and repeat the same things time and time again, because that's how you mitigate risk, be it economic risk or safety risk or environmental risk, all those sorts of things. And so you think about bringing new construction materials and products to the market. There's no two ways about it. I think, David's right. Even if we had a Ministry for Resilience, which would be an extraordinarily progressive and forward-thinking move, it's the regulators and the politicians aren't going to be the ones that bring innovation. It's still going to rely on businesses like ours to innovate. Because that's how that innovation comes, in smaller packets, doesn't it? Particularly quicker. So I think all the industries that maybe there's a sense that there isn't the ambition to regulate do exist, and to innovate, do exist, but it's the sense of regulation which is a problem. You bring new construction materials to the market, there is environmental issues, there are, traffic and transport issues, there are taxation challenges, visibility and traceability challenges that exist because of the regulatory environment. So it feels to me that I just can't help but feel that sort of philosophical shift around risk and acceptance that there is, to make changes, there is some economic risk. And you know what? There might be some, managed but environmental risk, and there might be some risk around the amount of tax we generate as a country whilst people are being incentivized to innovate. It's that philosophical shift that this is important.
I think, just to Diane, I'll come to you on this one, and then would be interested in all of your views, that regulation is a very localized thing. So there's very little global regulation. Most regulation is done at sort of national level. And obviously there's lots of inconsistencies therefore. So I'd be interested from your point of view, Diane, as an international business, are there opportunities in certain countries where that regulation is more flexible? So the Netherlands is a good example of that, have really lent into the circular model, that we can start to really prove concept and grow from there. Is that an opportunity, do you think?
Yeah, no, it is. I suppose I would draw on the EPR legislation, extended producer responsibility. So that's about if an organisation puts something on the market, they need to have the end-to-end understanding of that product. They need to ensure that it's designed for recycling rather than just, and there'll be a cost to pay to make sure that regulation actually results in better recycling and circularity for that product. So they have to design in end of life, and they need to make sure that there's sort of 30% recycled content. So that again is driving that market. And they have that responsibility then throughout the life cycle of that product. And that's starting to show some positives, to show some shifts. But I think recently, with the recent geopolitical and the particularly in the UK, well, not just the UK, but that cost of living increasing, there's starting to be a little bit of pushback around, well, that's going to cost me another 11, 12 pence per bottle, for example, to put on the market, and the consumer will end up paying that, and then that goes back to government, which is actually the EPR legislation is actually, I think a good piece of regulation that's there for the right reasons, and that done properly will start to take that shift to a more circular way of putting consumables on the market. But that kind of unintended consequence of and looking at what's happening internationally at the moment is sort of meaning that that potentially government will look at that and say, oh, that's an area that we perhaps need to help and to look at and to start moving backwards a bit on because of this short-termism, because we're not
it's interesting because you sort of take one step further, and the government, to give them some credit, has implemented Michael Gove's 2018 strategy, extended producer responsibility, deposit return system, which is now on its way in October 27, is potentially 400,000 tons of pure material into not collecting cans and bottles that people think. It's 400,000 tons of pure material, as pure as you can get, 99% pure. And that's an amazing benefit to the UK. You think of that, of PET and steel and aluminium. So, they get scared, governments, because, we live in a media-driven world, 24/7 news and, opinion on everything, just as Jan was saying about this sort of pushback on cost of EPR, extended producer responsibility, is vital because it's the driving force of design. Without that, you won't get the systemic change that you need. After, implementing some of those good ideas, the government then, I think, did a really progressive thing, which was to develop a circular economy task force. And it drew in experts from all different areas to say, what's the next stage? What's the evolution post these sort of baseline systemic elements that's required? We've been waiting 6 months now for it to be published. And what's the fear about it being published? Well, someone's going to point the finger and say, it's going to cost 3 pence more on something. And that's not, as I go back to my point about resilience, it's not really having a holistic view on designing the UK to be a self-supporting nation, rather than the situation which it is, that it's externalised its entire production. We face shortages of CO2, shortages of fuel, energy.
Absolutely.
Because we haven't really thought about making sure that, we have the capacity within the UK to produce. I can think of steel as another great example. We were soon to have lost steel production in the UK. And, we're in all sorts of dangers of being held to ransom by other nations. So,
and does that not highlight, waiting for reports, waiting for governments to respond, does that not highlight the need for sort of innovation and corporations, companies to lead the way and let governments catch up? And Tim, I'd be interested, I think I mentioned just before Diane spoke about the Netherlands being an area or a country that seems to be friendly towards circularity. But can you think of any other examples around the world where we're starting to see perhaps places where we can see successes and then bring those to the UK rather than waiting?
Absolutely, yeah. I would say countries and societies where Japan is a good example, who actually have been, drivers of consumerism and the age of abundance through the mass production of lower cost consumer electronics, for example. The refining their ability to manufacture consumer electronics at the best possible price, car manufacture, all of those amazing progressive shifts in the way things are manufactured. But societally, there is a real kind of noticeable shift towards a rethink around the consumption of consumer products. And with a kind of lighter touch government, lighter touch regulation, you're actually starting to see changes being made. The one I'm most familiar with is things like retail and consumer goods, where the government there and industry are looking to reward and recognize financially retail businesses that are driving up the ability to access recycled and reused goods. Almost, it's a fascinating move because culturally, if you think about e-commerce returns, which in most other markets where e-com has has had a significant foothold in share of wallet, returns have become an important part of the customer experience, but a big problem for the retailers. That hasn't really happened in Japan because culturally, there is almost this kind of contract between the consumer and the retailer that once I've bought it, it's my responsibility. So returns are a tiny, tiny proportion of retail, even though this is a country where fashion is a pastime. It's a hobby. They sell swathes and swathes of products. But what that's created is more of a challenge on the consumers about what they do with items they don't want, because they're not sending them back to the brand and the brand's not being given the problem, but the consumer still has clothes they don't want to wear. And so there are schemes now being developed where, the consumer can benefit from reuse, recycling, resale of those items, benefit directly through things like taxation. And so, it feels like there are markets, governments, and like societies that are looking for better ways.
I think you can extend extended producer responsibility. My big hope is that they move away from the sort of the limited view of packaging, food packaging, which it tends to always start with. I think sometimes politicians understand the dustbin better than other types of product, and so they go there first. But again, if you talk about, Tim's saying, alludes to textiles, well, have a textile extended producer responsibility where the returns and the materials there have to be taken back at their cost. And there you see massive alteration. They would produce less. Why would you produce 2 billion items, jeans that you're never going to sell or even wear? So I think you can take the concept cradle to grave and start implementing it to different things. You think of tires, you can think of almost every single different product could have that sort of cradle to grave stewardship, which would alter, starting with design, starting with then onto the supply chains, through the consumer, and then back to them, and they will make sure that the economic sense, the business sense, is then baked into the business model they create.
I'll come to you. It's a bit of a difficult one for you, Jon, but I was going to ask you, who owns the problem? So if we start talking about accountability, if we start talking about EPR, who owns the problem, and where do we start to place that accountability? And happy for you to sort of use that in the context of the markets you know well.
It's an interesting debate, one that we have regularly. I mean, ultimately, you would assume, and you would like to think that the ultimate client, owns that problem. I think what we see is you see influence from the client. Mm-hmm. So in the UK, we're heavily government spended at the moment, whether it's direct or indirect spending through regulation. But ultimately, it has to be driven either by the client or it has to be driven by regulation. You, in a supply chain or as a contractor or a developer, ultimately, you need the client's support to either accept what they're going to be given at the end of it, because ultimately there is a difference. There's a view difference around, just insurance, loads of different things around products and design and how things work and who accepts that responsibility. So you need the client to be part of that problem and part of that solution as well at the same time. So for me, I think it's driven by the client has to take ultimate responsibility. You can give them choice, but they need to take that choice. And then I think unfortunately we come back to it again today is you have to look at where we've done really well at this. Okay, and you have to map that into the other areas of the economy that you need that to do that, and that comes down to good regulation. So I think one of the good areas that is often not spoken about and is forgotten about, the landfill tax reform, which was brought in a long time ago, was absolutely fantastic. If you look at how we don't waste airspace now, we try and minimise our impact, how much we reuse due to that, it was a fantastic piece of regulation. What no one's really doing is picking that up and looking at it going, well, that's an industry that's done very, very well. Why are we not, in materials side of construction, doing quite as well? And the answer is because we haven't looked at it in that dynamic. And I think the other thing as well, when you really look at the challenges, when you talk about full life of a product, that's fine going forward, but it doesn't deal with the next 20 years that we've got to recover.
Yeah.
So 1 minute you're going on site and you're looking at how do you use that product, but you've got stuff from 1947 that was built that you've got no recollection of, and it's probably been tampered with at least 10 times through its life. So I think the other thing that we've probably got to do is just stand still for a little bit and go, okay, so here's industries that have done it well, dealing with historical waste as well as new waste. So what is it we can learn about historical materials and actually new materials now, and bring the two together? So I think it can be client driven, but definitely has to be regulation.
You shouldn't really, favour the use of virgin materials because the spec's right, it costs less. When, as Jon's saying, they've got to deal with the reclamation and demolition of buildings, and there's so much valuable material in that which then is squandered. which could be effectively used if there was more latitude to say, you start with that, you use that first before you go to virgin material.
Agreed. I think the other thing as well is it probably doesn't answer the question, but certainly for the construction sector, I think there's a lack of understanding about what circularity actually means.
Yes.
Okay, so I think in construction up until the last few years, if I'm honest with you, even businesses like ours think about that means about recycling.
Yeah.
Okay, and actually that's not what it really means.
No.
Full life reuse is what circularity is, in terms of how you actually, you reduce the need for that virgin product that was spoken about right at the start. So I think just a bit more in our world as business, we can also be a bit clearer around how we are taking the word circularity and what we see our responsibilities are, and we could be more forthright about what that then actually means needs to change. And that's where I go back to what I said earlier about actually driving government a bit. If we embrace the word circularity and we actually understand what it means for a building project in the UK, whether it's infrastructure or not, you would have a very different output.
Yes.
Design for circularity.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, it's funny about, we talked about a bit on waste hierarchy, which is a common phrase used in our industry, certainly. But, that inverted the use of material effectively. And that you could do the same effectively in yours business, John. That the first thing you do is, minimisation and then reuse, etc., rather than what we're doing now is completely starting from the wrong end.
I think the one other thing that's worth noting is we're program driven. Right now, we're time driven.
Yeah.
And that's quite interesting when you talked about large infrastructure earlier. We spend a lot of time planning that infrastructure, which is mainly around planning and those kind of regulatory things. But in that period, we don't spend any time thinking about how you do that in the most sustainable circularity kind of way. Which means that when you get to the project and you start talking about actually trying to build that project, we are into a time constraint.
Yes.
And program costs so much more than actually the use of a product. So what always comes down to the real deciding thing is, can I deliver my project, and at what speed can I deliver it? And the problem is, unless you plan right at the outset of some of this big infrastructure work, is that I can assure you that the circular products you need to do that are never available at the right time. So you have to overlay the two things together. Certainly for construction, you have to overlay when does the waste or the non-use of a product become available, and how do we bake that into our forward infrastructure and our forward construction plans to make sure that actually it's available at the right time for the right product.
Got you.
That's about creating demand, though, isn't it, John?
Yes, create demand. Yeah.
Because if it's specified, you must use in the hierarchy, then people would produce it.
And that goes back to my point around the landfill regulation. I think it was great. It's a reverse of that. The landfill regulation is about not using something for the wrong use, for not putting it in the hole. That's where it did really, really well because it changed the whole mindset.
I think also that it gave the escalator, which was a 5-year programme, gave longevity. It was the first time there was any form of longevity associated with waste regulation. And that's what gave people the confidence to invest.
Agreed.
Dan, what would you say would be sort of the biggest changes you could see if that accountability was real? If we start to see more of that accountability, more of those shifts in perhaps the markets you're working in?
I think we've mentioned textiles a couple of times. I think there's some companies doing some really good things, like for example, Patagonia, Dry Robe, Sea Salt. There's some, they'll do repairs on their returns, and they're trying to keep as much as they can in circulation. And I think that works really well but it is those more expensive brands, I guess, and not everybody can afford those pieces of clothing or outdoor wear and so on that they'll use and want repairing for a long time. And when you look at the kind of the more fast fashion end, the margins and so on are just not there to be able to do that. But we are seeing more requests for when returns come through for cleaning those, for repairing them, for doing small repairs and then back into circulation. So that's starting to increase, and I think that sort of rental model as well. But again, that's starting to gain a bit more of a market share. And then you've got models such as Vinted, for example, where people, again, that's starting to turn a profit after several years, but it's it's been able to stick with it and take that longer term investment. And I think that is something that companies and businesses do have to recognise, that it's not something that's going to happen overnight. You do need to set a trajectory and put that investment in, and it might take a few years. I suppose Interface Carpet's another good example of that, where they, was about sort of back in the 90s that they were starting to look at recycled carpet and fibres and so on. But it's only in the last, 10 years or so that's really started to turn a corner and become much more of an acceptable way, and back and circular into carpet and other fabrics. I guess the other end of that is the with, like we were talking about, with the textiles EPR coming in, where you can return clothes and or you can take them back for recycling. But again, it's building that recycling infrastructure in Europe and in the UK. And I think those kind of two things aren't really happening in tandem, but they do need to happen in tandem. And then I guess
it's a significant amount of material.
It's
just close 1 million tons goes to landfill.
It's huge.
Or to incineration. So,
or to Africa.
Or Africa is about 40% going to Ghana, which is so it's a major problem. Diane's right about the infrastructure behind it. You can't do these things on sort of a voluntary scale.
No,
this has to have really, again, governmental assistance. But I think for me, as I do listen to politics, there's a sort of a dichotomy between what politics are saying around growth. So they talk about growth constantly because that will solve everything for us.
Absolutely.
But what it is really contrary to what we're discussing today.
Absolutely.
And so, can you get growth without the damage? And going back to this sell more, sell it quick, sell it cheap, stack it high type of mentality. And I think we have to really rephrase that. And that's why I think resilience is quite an interesting thing, where you can develop, supply chains within your own country and support your own industry. But that takes a radical rethink of politics who hope that growth can pick up the bill for mismanagement.
That there for me is to come back to that kind of the inconvenient truth, which is the sort of the message in the podcast, is that the inconvenient truth is that until we reframe that, until we stop using growth as a metric for success and economic success, things won't necessarily change as quickly as we need to. Which brings me on to the last section, which is thinking about geopolitical shocks, supply chain vulnerability, resource security. Do we see those factors being the trigger for that tipping point, to which we start to realise that it's not a nice to have, that tipping point needs to take us to a world in which growth is not possible? It's almost the architecture of our downfall rather than being the architecture for our success. So just interested in the last sort of few minutes we have to come to you, perhaps Jon first, and then go around the table to give your thoughts on that.
I'm going to come at that from a completely different thing. I think one of the biggest shifts that we maybe don't give credit to is the youngsters coming through. Okay, so I think the youngsters will have much more say in the change than we probably had. I think they're much more vocal. I think they're much clearer about where their principles lie and what they buy into and what they don't. So I think there's an opportunity as business starts to evolve, and when I say the younger generation, I mean younger generations coming through now are much more aware about what it costs, what the usage is, what the impact is to the environment. They're much more sensitive to it. They've been brought up in a different era. So I think they'll force the change faster, because I don't think they'll accept that they're not doing anything.
That's a great answer.
So as they start to fall into business, I think they'll start to shape us. They won't want to work for businesses that don't think like that. Okay, they won't want to work for what they will class as archaic management.
Yeah, they're
going to want to work for the progressive firms. So I think they'll then fall into some politics, and they'll fall into different thinking groups and things like that. And I think the pace, we have the opportunity, if they're heard and they're given some autonomy and some authority, I think they can drive pace. They can drive change at a faster pace than we've probably been able to. Is how I would look at it. So I think the one that wasn't on the list there was the youngsters, where I think they can really help us.
Thank you. Tim?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I would say, these geopolitical shocks, crises that feel like they've been such part of, the world, the planet for the last sort of couple of decades, really. I think they can. I think genuinely believe they can be the trigger for long-term thinking around circularity, a change in long-term thinking in circularity. On one hand, that the shift to more like nationalism, like localization, is it's a worry from a societal perspective, and it's a worry from a cultural perspective. But maybe for industry, maybe for changing behaviours and less reliance on globalization. Maybe it's a good thing, because maybe actually it's going to be easier for us as countries, as United Kingdom, as society, to make some of these changes like on our own back without the rest of the world. And I think whilst supply chains are getting disrupted on such a regular basis now, that kind of the globalization and its driving of abundance feels way more fragile than it's ever done. And you never know. Maybe this era is going to change sort of government's view and sense of this, and also the clients that Jon described earlier on. Those people who ultimately own the problem and the opportunity are those that are making the big decisions and spending the money. Maybe this is it.
It demonstrates the destructive nature of scarcity.
Yes.
That's what it does, doesn't it, really? One thing I would sort of add to this is in order to really plan a society, I think you've got to look at data. I think we're very poor at data. In the commercial and industrial waste sector, which I work in predominantly now, there is no good data whatsoever. There is in the domestic, municipal side, it's quite good data because they're forced to collect it. The rest of it, nobody knows. How do you make policy when you don't have proper data? And then I think you could take that to a national level and look at the flows of material within the UK and the potential to capture those flows in order to put them to better use, in order to do all the things we've discussed to do today around circularity. So I would definitely ask the government to look much more at the data that it controls and really have that sort of lens of sort of resilience that they need to start looking at, in my view.
A sort of better understanding of what we have.
Yeah.
Diane?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got to be optimistic about it, and try and take that view when these major things do happen. So, for example, with energy, we've seen that, haven't we, over the last few years, and then it's got businesses, governments to sit up and think we need to be more secure about our energy, and I think more recent crisis will make us think the same about our food security and the materials that we need. And as I mentioned earlier, it's already starting to happen with some of that infrastructure being invested in the UK to close the loop, particularly on supermarkets, which obviously is a major part of our food industry. So there's definitely businesses thinking about that and trying to do the right thing, and organisations supporting them to do that. But yeah, it's got to be backed by longer term thinking, particularly from our governments, and joining that up with the EU and with those global supply chains as well.
Thank you. So, given that the consumer factor was one that we all agreed was sort of one that gave us a level of hope, do you think we framed circularity far too much as an ethical sort of choice rather than one that's economically rational? So I'd just be interested to get each of your views on that. I don't know if you want to start, Diane.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier with vintage, so that sort of the rise of that way of purchasing clothes and other items, and I've heard some statistics recently, something like 30% of a I always get my generations wrong, but that sort of younger generation coming through of their wardrobe is reused and pre-loved, and I know that's certainly true for my family. My son's, most of what he buys is pre-loved. So so that is a definite shift. Well, I suppose one thing that perhaps is not as optimistic, I think, is perhaps things like, some of that younger generation vapes and so on, and that disposable element of it, and just kind of throwing that away, which has all sorts of implications for the industry around fires and in the recycling sector. So there is a bit of that dichotomy. I think I absolutely agree that there's lots of that generation coming through that do get it, that do something differently, that will shape for sure. But then there's also a bit of that generation that are still quite throwaway, still quite fast fashion.
And that's a cost thing, I guess.
That is a cost thing. Absolutely, it is.
So they see the value in the fact that clothes are cheaper and equally as good buying for a second time.
Yeah.
But perhaps when it comes to their smoking habits, less so.
Yeah,
David?
Exactly.
Yeah, I think what we're trying to recreate is something that's not new. You don't have to go so far back post the Second World War, the 1950s. And I just look at household waste recycling sites as a really good sort of lens on that. I can remember one particular fantastic photograph when everything on the site was being recycled or reused. There was no residual waste. It was taking in materials, pre-preparing them and repairing them, etc. And I, like my kids as well, they choose pre-loved clothes, and that's something that I really do appreciate. And when I buy my own clothes, today I'm wearing a recycled shirt, for instance. So I do really think about the implications of your consumer choice. But again, let's go back almost to the past in order to win back when we were very good at repairing shoes and darning your socks and all sorts of stuff that I can remember doing in my lifetime, which was a very important change in consumer behaviour.
But I think it's also making that attractive for young people coming into those industries to learn those skills for repair and and all those different skills that we're going to need in the future to be able to design these products that have got that longevity of life, the recycling content and so on. And just those skills that we've lost over all those years.
Tim?
Yeah, I think that like Vinted is a really good example. eBay's been around for decades now, and was a platform where consumers could access pre-loved goods. That business in lots of parts of the world now has shifted more to being a primary selling channel rather than a secondary selling channel. And therefore, new businesses and new models have seen the opportunity to fill the gap. And that's been great to see the level of adoption that has come. I would say when I think about, I've got two boys, teenagers, and they both buy off of Vinted as well. For me, yes, it's the economic benefit, but also it's availability.
Yes.
And so the products are available, and they're not always buying. I mean, it's pretty rare they're buying something from this season. So I think what it starts to do is it starts to throw a bit of a light on, is the seasonality thing in fashion real? These short windows, 8-week cycles when a product comes and goes, the early onset of, when ASOS first came on, they really, in the UK, they started to change the game, because they built an amazing supply chain that allowed them to have so many SKUs that would cycle on short periods of time. I wonder whether what we're seeing now from that generation, today's teenagers and early 20-somethings, is that they are actually not that focused on what is in season. They're focused on what is cool, what they like. And actually fashions don't seem to change as frequently as maybe they were for a period in the 2000s, and it seems to be a bit more stable. So if it's about availability, and that's the thing that's driving that culture, maybe changes in supply chain, the complication and the cost of globalization now. I mean, who knows where fuel prices will get to. These shipping lines, I mean, how many times can you disrupt shipping lanes fundamentally
Absolutely.
and they can survive, at the scale they're at, to the extent they're at. So I think we're going to see availability challenges. And personally, I think from a consumer perspective, that is absolutely right. We should have access to fewer products, frankly.
Yeah. So we're sort of seeing there that if you like, ethics was a luxury.
Yeah.
But actually availability
economic
is
sense
the thing.
economic
is what's going to change stuff.
availability, and the more the more, we end up starting, drawing a ring around your local market as your core source of supply. Next day delivery. I don't know if you've noticed, but just next day delivery used to be an absolute given in that space. It just isn't anymore.
No,
it just isn't. And therefore, it's not that long ago everyone was talking about same day delivery. Same day delivery is what it's got to be. This is where the investment was all going. And somebody said to me once, it's all very well, there's all these businesses going into same day delivery, but I can't tell you the last time I had a jeans emergency.
No, very true.
And it kind of pointed. It was a huge amount of money going into these businesses doing like same day delivery to your door. But there wasn't actually a problem statement that it was like repairing. It was just
and actually what you're seeing is, I think, that's less of a guarantee, which is a good thing, I think. But also, I think there's almost an acceptance in the delivery supply chain that you would break a certain amount, you would lose a certain amount, and that almost became an acceptable tolerance.
Yeah.
So again, it goes back to that. The economics of it are that we don't want to see that.
Yeah.
We want to see quality products arriving within a sensible window.
Yeah.
Not
exactly,
to your point, satisfying a jeans emergency.
Yeah.
John, to finish up, ethics as a choice or economic rationalisation?
I think the mindset is changing. Certainly from a UK perspective, I think people are interested where it comes from. I think people do care how it got there and how it was made and ultimately what they might be impacting one way or another. So I think we're going full circle. It feels like I quite like the idea of just after the war. I can remember when I was young, I can remember collecting cans or collecting bottles and getting paid for them. And you take them to the shop, and that was the way of recycling. It was an incentivized solution. So I didn't quite understand what it meant, but I certainly understood the benefit of it.
Absolutely. 10 pence per bottle.
Yeah, 100%. So and it had, you had money and you got stuff off. So I think what you're starting to see is that mentality come back in. And I think if we do a good job of explaining what the impacts are, I think that will speed up significantly. In terms of how people view things. And I think the more people want to know where it come from, how it got there, what the impact was, then so industry will be forced to change because we'll be forced to produce that information. And by producing that information, you'll then realise what the negative impact is and you'll start to think differently. So I've got quite high hopes actually from a circularity point of view, is that actually as we start to blend an old way of thinking and a younger way of thinking where education is different, the mindset changes. And the one I often refer to is we don't have any plastic in our house, like bottles, because when my two young daughters come through school, they're a bit older now, is that they were dolphin killers. So someone attached, plastic in the water to killing dolphins, that meant that our house had to change because we weren't going to be the dolphin killers. So I think it's quite important that if you start to actually make it real and you show what the impacts are to local businesses, where things come from, the scarcity, that naturally will change and the mindset will change. So I think it's a mixture between explaining it to allow the ethics to then be created that makes people make those choices.
So is it, you don't have to abandon ethics. It can be a blend of both, right? So it's ethics that perhaps drives the change, economics that takes us the rest of the way.
I think a similar one, a real indicator of shifting attitudes, and not just in those younger age groups, the kind of the younger parts of society, but more broadly, is, I went to school in the 70s and 80s, and if you were the charity shop kid, like you were ridiculed.
Absolutely.
That was not a great label to have. No. Whereas now it's really embraced, and Vinted ultimately is, whilst it's not raising money for charity, is the ultimate charity shop, the global charity shop. Now it's embraced and it's encouraged and, and you get lots of personal credit for the fact you found whatever it is, a naff hoodie on Vinted. So I think just that as a societal change, that as an indicator, is a big one because that's going to stick with a whole generation for a long time.
Yeah, it's attaching value.
Yeah, attaching value to
that product you discussed, but also going back to John's point about deposit return system. It's coming back October 27. Now we all remember it well, the pop bottles, Corona, and this sort of stuff. That it was. You attached a value to a material, and we lost that for many, many generations. I think now reascribing value to materials, whether it's social, whether it's environmental, or there's a monetary understanding, is a key driver to change.
So I think for me, within that, I think I've got one final sort of question for each of you, but I think the optimism around the next generation, that momentum we're building, that sense that perhaps localism, nationalism could be used for good, that actually owning our problems and not pushing them onto other shores is really important. I think data, and given the world that we live in which there is a plethora of data on most things, simply sort of turning the lens towards this particular area, really important. And I think, Dan, your point there in terms of the fact that I think organisations, there is good intent. I think we see good intent. So it feels to me that there are some really good sort of a sense of sort of tides turning, perhaps. So just one thing I want to finish on, and then we'll finish up, is just to leave me with one assumption, perhaps, that you no longer believe that's relating to the circular economy. So I'll start with you, Jon.
That it's someone else's problem. So I think as business for a long time, we wait for regulation to land and then we act. And I think there's an understanding now that the businesses that will come out on top, whether it's from using AI into business or whether it's just from scarcity that we spoke about earlier, the businesses that actually sit there and don't wait for regulation but actually start to vocalise change, start to build it in early, start to think about those, will be the ones that come out the most successful. So certainly from our business's point of view is we're really thinking about ultimately what's our role in this and how do we promote it, both to the staff and then externally to other organisations and other bodies.
Tim?
Yeah, I'd say that I'll be entirely honest, having even worked in the world of e-commerce returns for 12, 13 years and invested a lot of money and time and effort in it, there was a time where I believed it would never change at scale. I just had a sense that if you could build a business that dealt with those brands and in those niches where this was important to them, for whatever reason, whether it's economic or reputational, that was the opportunity. So I'd say 2016, 2017, 2018, that was my sense. But I don't see it now. I think it can change at scale. I've seen enough of actual action to suggest that big, established, mature industries do understand there is value in this.
Thank you.
I think if you get enough like-minded people sat four together, like-minded, I can feel, then the way forward is through better collaboration. If companies, supply chains truly believe, as we do, give waste a second life, then I think there is some note of optimism.
Thank you. Diane?
I think that the myth that it always costs more, that sustainability costs more, that circularity costs more. I think there is a need for investment, but I think if we don't do it as a society and as businesses, then that will cost a lot more in the long term. So it's worth thinking about it now, doing things a bit differently, getting that investment in. And as I say, lots of businesses that we work with are doing that, are starting to do that, are more interested in doing that than they ever have been before. So, yeah, I do share that optimism.
Thank you. Look, thank you all for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you.
And thanks for sharing such, I think, interesting points. And I hope that we can do this again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If there's one thing this discussion makes clear, is that the circular economy is not held back by a lack of ideas. It's held back because making it work involves difficult choices. It affects cost, ownership, incentives, and in some cases, the very way entire industries operate. And maybe that's the deeper issue. We still treat circularity as a moral obligation, when most economic systems only scale once participation becomes commercially advantageous. Previous generations reused, repaired, and maximised resources, not because it was ethical, but because it made economic sense. So that gap between ambition and reality is not a knowledge gap, it's an incentive gap, it's a decision gap. Until organisations, governments and consumers are aligned around a model where circular behaviour creates commercial value rather than commercial friction, I think circularity will remain widely supported and narrowly implemented.